Thank you everybody for joining. I appreciate you being here. Some of y'all might have felt like you had to. Today we're going to talk about building cultural competencies. This is something that you might not necessarily think about in your day-to-day life, but every interaction you have, whether it's someone you know very well or a stranger to you, or just someone you see and start to assume things about, has an effect on the way you perceive the world. That's your competency related to culture, related to your home of origin, related to your ethnicity, and all the things. So we're going to talk about all the different definitions that relate to cultural competency. Some people might call this intercultural competency or proficiency. People that do DEI trainings, they have a few words that they essentially mean the same thing. But what I'm going to focus on today is more about the socialization cycle and how we learn the things that we have that become our belief system about other people, and a little bit about how we can adjust that.
Yeah, so when really doing this session, it was bias in the debates. Our phone started coming on, our friends started emailing us about it. But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that little judgments you might not agree with. Sometimes the shortcuts are based on race. First, for some clarity, saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone racist. The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in America. A lot of times, we're using it educating their old time, and Ku Klux Klan power. But implicit bias is anywhere near that, explicit. Implicit bias comes out of ordinary mental function, out of how the mind works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we've heard at home, or education. Think that as a flaw we've been thinking our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that flaw causes associations. How do you divide?
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and Black women here together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside of that taught that Black men were violent, aggressive, and not to be trusted. They're criminals, they're thugs.
With all those associations, and I try to let some of those, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias, its relationship to race, and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
So that's just a brief introduction to the idea of implicit bias. And before, they did mention a few of those vocabulary terms about associations. As I mentioned in my little story at the beginning, the second you see someone else, you are already creating an idea about them or a story about them. And that's because we're humans. Humans have evolved to do this. It is our gift if it is something that saves our life. And potentially it can be a problem for us if we are making false assumptions. For instance, if we were back in our evolutionary caveman days and we made contact with someone else, and because the last time we met a stranger, it worked out well. Maybe we traded something, maybe we hunted you, I don't know. But this particular person caused us harm, killed somebody, something like that. Now, because of my assumption, I'm in danger of my genes not getting passed on. So humans have evolved for 50-ish thousand years now, related to this particular thing, to get very good at creating a story about someone you just met. And the way we do that is by all the things that were put into us to create a stereotype or an implicit bias. So implicit meaning you can't really control it. The students in the room, they took implicit bias tests. We did some for anti-Asian bias, we did some for white or dark-skinned people bias, and even some for straight and gay bias. There's many bias tests online that you can access. And you can see by using a keypad how fast your association comes up with the words on the screen. And at the end it tells you, are you a little racist, a lot racist, or not racist at all. So even myself, who tries to be as unbiased as possible, was slightly biased on a few of those different tests. I really wish I wasn't, but it's just how we were raised, that initial thought that pops into your head. That's that implicit thought. And then what you do with that thought is how you become a better human being. So when we're going to talk about cultural competencies, I just wanted to put up this visual here. This is a cultural iceberg. It's not mine. It's used in a lot of trainings. But essentially, it's the idea of there's the things you can view or see or observe about a people or a specific person, but there's a lot more that you can't see, that you don't know. So when we think about engaging with people that are unfamiliar to us, their story might match your story almost identically. But if you're only judging them on their age, or their clothes, or their behaviors, or the things you can see, you might not want to make that connection based on that. And that might be fine, but it's not as embracing of all people as it could be. And that's our goal for us. So as I mentioned, today we're going to learn how we judge others. Why do we do this? And then how we interact with other people, and a little bit about adapting our mindset along the way. So, as I mentioned, humans are designed to see potential threats, similarities as being safe. This instant brain reaction keeps our ancestors safe, helps our genes move from early human life to today. But our modern world is vastly different than the one our bodies were designed for. We carry with us the same inherent traits as our earliest human ancestors. And unlike most other animals that have a pretty simplified life cycle, the world around them is survive, eat, mate, repeat. Our journey is a little bit broader because we are taught a lot of things when we are younger versus other types of animals that have a little bit more of a survival instinct from birth or from hatching. So, smarter people than me have created something called the cycle of socialization. And this is the whole cycle. We'll go through a few of these steps. Essentially, the cycle revolves around the most basic or core feelings: fear, ignorance, confusion, and insecurity. So think about that newborn baby. We're exposed to the world we can barely see, barely hear. We have some understanding of the world around us, but it's hazy. And we know nothing. We don't know if we're safe, if we're crying. It's an instinct. So from a blank slate perspective, which is also a psychology term that is not exactly related to this, but somewhat adjacent, we have emotions that we can all relate with when encountering something new, including people at any age. So who are our first teachers? Typically it is the people or the environment around us when we are most vulnerable. From the moment we're born, we're shaped by the people who care and nurture us, typically our families. They influence how we see ourselves, the expectations for our behavior, the roles that we adopt, and the future we want for ourselves. These individuals model behaviors and teach us societal norms, instilling ideas about how we should think about ourselves and how we interact with others. We receive messages such as, boys shouldn't cry, you can't trust certain people, or children should be seen but not heard. These lessons are the foundation of early socialization. We rarely question these ideas because we're dependent on our caregivers. We can't think critically at a very young age, so we just take what we are interacting with as the truth or something that we just absorb into ourselves. And as a result, we internalize their perspectives and their values without any resistance. It's too young to do that. So on the scale itself, there's the relatives, the teachers, the people we trust, the shapers of our expectations, etc. Most of the messages we receive about how to be, whom to look up to, and who to look down on, what rules to follow, what roles to play, and assumptions to make, what to believe, what to think and reinforce and contradict what we have learned at home. Come from the places we go to when we are young that start to shape our personality and our character and our belief system about everyone else. We learn who gets preferential treatment. We learn who gets picked on. We're exposed to rules, roles, and assumptions that are not fair for everyone. If we're the member of a group that benefits from the rules, we may not notice that they aren't fair. If you are in the majority culture that tends to make the societal rules, things might go okay for you depending on who you are within that system. But it's probably better for you than to be a minority in the system that isn't really set up for your specific characteristics. If we're members of groups that are not the majority, sometimes we're penalized by those rules. We learn the world may not be set up in a way that life can sometimes have extra difficulties for people like us or people like them. So the institutions they mention are churches, schools, television. We know the media really has an effect on what I see and learn for sure. Someone's mental health and the mental health of people around them, businesses, and then culturally, the practices, the songs, the language, the media, and the patterns of thought within that home culture shape the way we think about ourselves and others. So now we're going to look a little bit about how are these things reinforced. So let's assume now we're no longer a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or even a 1-year-old. We're getting a little bit older, and we're starting to recognize, well, some of the things that I heard when I was younger might be true, and some of the things might not be exactly the way I learned them. How am I going to decide which ones I let go of, these ideas or beliefs, and which ones I'm going to embrace? A lot of the times it comes down to how they're enforced. And that's more of a psychology term. What is the thing that's going to make it stick with you or not? People who try to contradict the norm tend to pay a price for independent thinking in a system where that is not considered a strong trait. People who conform receive the benefit of being left alone for not making waves, such as acceptance in their designated roles, being considered normal, a team player, or being allowed to stay in their place. That can be literal place as well. They receive rewards and privileges for maintaining the status quo, access to higher places, attention, and recognition for having made it if you happen to be a minority within the majority culture. Privilege that brings money, connections, and sometimes power. People who go against the grain, conventional messages, are often accused of being troublemakers, making waves, or being the cause of a problem. If they're members of targeted groups, or just minority groups in certain places, they're held up as examples of why this group is inferior to the empowered majority group. Does that make some sense? If everyone has the same mindset and you are slightly different from that, it's going to stick out, it's going to be obvious. Then it becomes, are you rewarded for sticking out, or do you get consequences for that? And you learn these things on day-to-day behavior throughout all our lives. Things are either being enforced or stigmatized, you're given privileges or privileges are taken away, you're either discriminated against or you're celebrated, and those things teach you about your own character, but they also teach you about the world where you're existing in, and how that society works, and there are things you need to do differently to be in harmony with that particular society. Whether that's yours, or whether you came here as an international student and you recognize here in Thailand we do things like this, you need to sort of assimilate in certain ways to make your life easier. And if you didn't do that, it wouldn't make your life impossible, but it would make your life harder. And a lot of that has to do with the social norms and the way systems are set up. When we arrive at the results of this cycle, we face the decision of what to do next. It's easiest to do nothing. Simply allow the perpetuation of our status quo. We may choose not to make waves or stay in our familiar patterns. We might say, oh well, it's been that way for hundreds of years, what can I do to change it? Until our discomfort becomes larger than our comfort, we'll probably stay in this cycle. So in our University of Well class, we learn about evolutionary psychology, I talk about the cost-benefit ratio. If things are too costly, we choose not to do those. If they have more benefits than costs, we tend to do more of those things because it's either easier or we get rewarded for it, even if to push through some difficulty to do it. And that's the same for making changes in the society or making change for yourself. If you grew up in a system that was very liberal and you have more conservative values, it might take getting some pushback for you to live the way you want to live, and vice versa. If you grew up in a conservative area or socialization where people think a certain way and you think differently or act differently, you're going to have to get some pushback or remove yourself from that situation for you to live your best life, potentially. So that becomes, what direction do you take if you need to make that change? So that could be interrupting that cycle, that could be education, that could be taking a stand for something you believe in or something that you see in society as what you decide is wrong, or reframing something about an argument or a decision that's made to have a different perspective, or just keep things the way they are. If you're in that majority culture, it makes a lot of sense to do that. Some people don't always have the ability to not make a choice. That's sort of a privileged position as well. When groups empower themselves by learning more about each other and by unlearning old myths and stereotypes by challenging what is presented to us, we can make a difficult decision to interrupt the cycle of socialization. When we look at ourselves holistically, we might notice that parts of us can be labeled pretty easily by the way we look, and others are hidden, similar to the iceberg we saw before. Bias may affect us in different ways depending on our context or the situation we find ourselves in, which might be different. So, activity number 1. At your table, you should have a social identity wheel. There are wheels that have more internal parts or below the iceberg parts. This is not one of those wheels. This is pretty much the basic PG version of identity wheels. You'll see some of the words on there, and there's some definitions below, which is why I chose this example of that. Fill in the white outer circle with your specific social identities, as you feel comfortable doing. So if I was doing it, I'll just a QR code if you needed a PDF of this. So the examples below are there for you. This is from Canada, so it has some Canada-specific terms, but most of them are pretty universal when it comes to language. So for religion or spirituality, I don't mind sharing that I was not raised in a particularly religious household. My mother was Jewish faith, but not very, I won't say celebrating, but they weren't really into it. They did a menorah at Hanukkah, and their parents were kind of raised in it, but not in their own house. So we had Hanukkah, grandparents would come, we liked the things, and my father's more from a Protestant or sort of Christian faith, but we never went to church. So I could say I wasn't really raised with religion. So I don't have that implicit bias, or I don't have that bias of particular dogma on the top of my decision making. So for me, I'd put atheist. My age, I'm 42 and half. Generation, probably just a Gen Z. I was born, I graduated in 2000, so I think that makes me Gen Y, actually. Gen Y2K, yeah. Somewhere in between them. Gender identity, I'm male. Other identities, that could be something like, I like watching YouTube, gamer, all these things that you might fit in. My language is English and a little bit of Spanish and barely any Mandarin. My national origin would be America, and then my 23andMe's would be something like Ukraine, Poland, North Germany, and Scotland, as far as my ethnic origin, or race and ethnicity. So that's a social identity. Take a minute and share at your table if you don't mind. Not your specific answers, but now that you have filled it in our culture, our shared culture of being in Bangkok, Thailand at Verso International School in this room at this moment, are you in the majority group, the power group, or are you in a marginalized group? So you could say, oh, let's look at one of these. Age. Do older people or younger people, generally, have more status in Thai society? I don't. 9, what do you think? Older or younger people, who has more status? The older people? And what about really old people, like elderly? Because in America, where I was raised, older people have more status because you have more power and you kind of create. But once you get to be elderly, you're in the nursing home, you're sort of the forgotten generation by then. So if you were an elder person, maybe in Thailand, you're more respected. I think that's a stereotype in Asia generally compared to America. But multi-generational living is very popular here. When I lived in Japan, almost everybody had a grandmother in the house and they were still valued. But in America, where it's a little bit more individualized, it's not as much. That's not everybody's house, but that was my house. So if you were very old, you might have less status. If you're very young, you might not have much status. So if you're in that middle group, you might have the most status, just related to age. But then let's go down to gender identity. Do women or men in Thai society have more or less status? 10, what do you think? Or is it equal? Or does it depend? Okay, so if I was going to look at workers at a school, I could guess women are in the majority. Maybe not with the highest status, but as far as if I counted up every teacher, stereotypically, teachers are female from where I'm from, my perspective. That's a bias. It may be true, but it also is a bias. And then if I looked at leadership, so we have a few female leaders, we have a few male leaders. I think there might be a slightly more male leaders for upper loop and slightly more female leaders for lower loop. And then our very head of school, if we're looking at Ryan, that's a male. And I think the heads, international schools worldwide are slightly more male than female. And maybe the teacher base is more female as well. But if I look in the HR room, if I look at finance, if I look at the local hires, which is its own status, local hire versus expat teacher status, right? There's probably almost all female. And then if I looked at their groundskeepers, I just see a mix of male and female. So maybe it just depends on the role. If I looked at construction workers, probably a bunch of men for the most part, right? Although I do see a lot of young women doing construction work in Thailand versus other places where it's not as they might not be from Thailand. So that's the social identities. You could do this at your table for each of these chunks or triangles. Sometimes your group might be the favored group in a big society like Thai society or Asia, or something as specific as Bangkok versus Northern Thai. If you're Isan, if you're one of the hill tribes, do you have status equal to someone that is a city dweller here in Bangkok? I don't know the answer to that. But I know sometimes people from minority groups are labeled as minority groups because they want to keep some heritage and the government gives them subsidies to do that. But it's also, you gotta make sure you wear your outfit, you gotta sell your stuff at a fair. So I don't know how fair that is, but you gotta do what you gotta do. So that could be up or down, depending on who you are, on what side of the bed you woke up on. Do you consider yourself as a male or a female, and in where is it good for you and where is it not so good for you? That could change. In fact, I'm going to show you a little bit later how entire societies have been changing, although it might be hard to read on the big screen. So that is the social identity. There's other examples of this exercise that have a lot more of the internal stuff. It's not so good for like a giant group, but it's good for small groups to learn about one another if there's a comfortable place. And that relates back to belonging. If you feel like this is pretty surface level, and you can have these conversations, because it might be about you, but you can talk generally. But when we get into things like sexual orientation, or the times where you've had issues in your society based on a character trait that you have, it's a little bit more personal. People aren't always willing to share this. But when you are feeling accepted, one personal ideas, that becomes something that you really value, a place that likes you and loves you for who you are, good and bad traits, or regardless of your traits, you feel accepted there. That's the true identity and belonging goal, but not our topic of the day. Okay, so I mentioned I was going to show you something. This is something that's been kept and edited every year, every few years, for like 50 years. And it's the Engelhardt-Wetzel World Cultural Map. So just so it makes it easy for you, Thailand is right here. China's right here, Taiwan, Hong Kong. What this is a representation, you could call it a map, I guess. They do. Survival versus self-expression, and traditional versus secular values. So if you were at the very bottom, going up and down, north-south here, you have more traditional values in your society, for whatever reason. And if you are at the very top, you would have more secular values, meaning you don't have religious dogma as the foundation for your beliefs. And that's up or down. And if you go from left to right, this is how connected socially to family units or familial units versus autonomy, independent thinking, self-thought. So is there conforming to the group, specifically family of origin, or are you more open and allowed to think for yourselves and be more independent? So you can imagine Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Australia, Great Britain, USA, slide more towards the right, because that's we stereotype them as being free-thinking or individual-type societies, right? And then if we look all the way to the left, Egypt, Zimbabwe, Tunisia, Iraq, Palestine, Yemen, etc., Moldova, they have the other side, where maybe family value or conservative family values specifically are on that side. It's not to say one is good or bad, it's just that is the type of a value, and this is the type of a value, and that's where you fall. And there's a lot of countries like that. And it changes. It's not always the way it looks right now. That particular map, the resource from there does research, and what they've noticed is the change in most countries related to female education and gender roles. When a society has more female empowerment, they tend to have more economy. And if you looked at that same map from like 30 years ago, when there's more education, some of those bubbles were a little bit further to the right, and now countries are sliding over to the, more conservative 30 years ago, more liberal now, and the economies in those countries tend to raise up, which is not on that map, but it's like a part of the research. So here's something that we will do together in a little bit, but I want to give you an overview. So when we're talking about intercultural communication and competency, it's one thing to be competent. You feel like you know yourself, you feel like you understand what your biases are. So when you see someone that is triggering those biases, you're able to put those aside, get to know a person, and move beyond that and form friendships and relationships. This sort of relates to workplace, but it could be any type of environment. So how does it actually work in the real world? Well, this guy, Hofstede, has a model, and he has looked at many countries, and we'll go to the list later. I put a few as an example. And he looks at power dynamics, individualism, motivation to succeed and achieve, and he looks at boundaries, and he looks at orientation of one's culture being long-term or a short-term goal. And he rates them. And they have 150,000 survey respondents all around the world to do this data. And it's also been going on since the 80s. So we can go to this website, we can add in countries we want to compare, and then they pop up, and you can see how people interact compared to one another. You can't just show one country, you have to have another country to compare it to for the map to work. But here's an example. So we have Canada as orange, China as gray, and Thailand as blue. When it comes to power distance, it's like how comfortable I am to be close to you. in our conversation or in the moments when we're near each other, maybe in an elevator, how comfortable are you to be close to someone when you have that choice? So Canada is much more comfortable, I'll read it the right way just so I don't mess it up, but they have about half the power distance rating of China. Individualism, Canada is way higher than Thailand as a power, and you might assume it's more of an individualistic culture compared to what Thai respondents would say. China is relatively close to Canada, motivation towards achievement and success. Thailand rates a little bit lower in that. Avoiding uncertainty, Thailand is higher than they are when it comes to individualism, but still lower in other ways. So Thailand rates higher in uncertainty avoidance. We'll look at what that is in just a second. And it's relatively close amongst all three countries for long-term orientation. You might find as a stereotype, looking long-term might be more of an Asian trait than an individualistic trait in a Western country, but we'll find out. In indulgence, China is the lowest here, Canada is the highest of the three, and 45 out of 100 for China. Yeah, so power distance is the extent to which less powerful members of society accept that power is distributed unequally. It's not allowed to simplify. So that would be unequal division of power. They're comfortable with that. Individualism, people only look after themselves and immediate family. Collectivism is when people come to belong in groups, families, organizations, who look after and exchange for loyalty. The third one, motivation towards achievement, decisiveness. The dominant values in society are achievement and success. Consensus, the dominant values in society are caring for others and quality of life. Uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which people feel threatened by uncertainty and ambiguity and try to avoid those situations. So you could say that Thailand, from this chart, is not a fan of uncertainty. Long-term orientation versus short-term, the extent to which people show a future-oriented or pragmatic perspective, rather than a normative or short-term point of view. And the last one, indulgence, the extent to which people express their desires and impulses. Weak control is called indulgence, and strong control is called restraint. So that is assuming that Canada is happy to tell you everything about themselves, whereas a Chinese person is much, much less likely, and Thailand is about half willing to share their inner thoughts with someone else. Okay, so here are our QR codes. If you want to scan the one on the left, it will take you to the charts. Country comparison. And then I'll come off of this and then we can look together. The one on the right is a report for those that are interested in all this data from the country comparison and how it relates to workplace organization, maybe for someone's Vertex or something similar, or you're just interested, that will take you to a free download PDF, or should, of their annual report. You can also go back and read previous reports. And it outlines all that country comparison data so that you can utilize your cultural competencies. So that's a bigger version of that map. And here's the country comparison tool. So I can edit this. Is there any country that you want to compare with Thailand? Shout out.
Africa.
You want to pick one?
South Africa.
South Africa.
That's nice.
One more, maybe?
Yeah.
US. Okay, so here are South Africa in orange, Thailand in gray, and United States in blue. So Thailand is the highest for power distance, the extent to which less powerful members of society accept that power is distributed unequally. So that might imply that South Africa and the United States don't appreciate when things are unequal. I know I'm an American, I can't stand when things are unfair. And I will voice that out, and I'll use some of my credit and social credit when I can to help others when I see something that's up there. This would imply that people in Thailand are just understanding and don't feel like they can make a change about that. Not individually, but as a stereotype in data. So hopefully, as young Thai people, you might see this and go, maybe that's something I could change the cycle of socialization about if I know that my society is cool with inequities. Or not, if you don't want to do that. Right? That's what we're talking about. Individualism. We have the United States very high compared to South Africa and Thailand. People only look after themselves and their immediate family. And it looks like South Africa and the United States are 63 and 62, so equal on motivation towards achievement and success. And Thailand is a bit behind, they're about half of that. And again, we know that Thailand is high on uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which people feel threatened by uncertainty and ambiguity, and they try to avoid that. Whereas America is a little bit less, they're a little bit more comfortable with ambiguity. The same for South Africa. Long-term orientation, here's one where there's a big difference amongst all of them. Thailand being the most comfortable with a long-term orientation, the extent to which people show future-oriented or pragmatic perspectives rather than a short-term point of view. And South Africa were really low on that in particular, which I don't know enough about South African culture and British colonialism or Belgian colonialism that went through there that maybe created those foundational values and how that relates to the local South Africans that were colonized and who was in that circle. So I can't answer a lot about South Africa there, but if anybody has insights, feel free. And it's relatively close again between South Africa and America for indulgence, meaning we're comfortable expressing our desires and impulses. In Thailand, again, more of the middle road, 45 there. So maybe that's a Buddhist value of keeping things a little closer to our chest or not sharing negative feelings out. I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. But that's part of cultural competency, is recognizing every culture or every country and the cultures within that have the potential to be vastly different than the ones that we're used to. And having some of this background knowledge, especially because this is work-based. If you're in an international work environment, which maybe a lot of you will go into, it's good to know these people from these places might feel a different way than you and how you can interact with them. And you can ask them about questions like this. That's how we build community, and ideally that's how we're doing it here at Verso, where we learn about each other. And it's not just the graph. If you do scroll down, each of these is described. So we can learn a low score of 18 in the dimension that means South Africa, the culture is more normative than pragmatic. People in these societies have a strong concern with establishing the absolute truth. They're normative in their thinking. They like black and white things. They exhibit great respect for traditions, a relatively small propensity to save for the future, and a focus on achieving quick results. So it's a cool website. There's other stuff that you have to pay for, so just go right to the country comparison tool. But you could share this with others and maybe use it as a resource in one of your classes or something like that. And they do explain each of them for every country. And it just changed that a lot. Yeah.